We're here for the Scoundrels, and Scallywags senior side of Georgetown tour. You were in the right place. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Bill Brown. I'm a ranger with the National Park Service here at the Georgetown Visitor Center. I'll give you a little bit of background about our walk today. It is going to take about an hour and 15 minutes. It involves about 15 minutes total walking at 8 stops. Okay, we're going to be walking on brick, some canal towpath type gravel, up a flight of stairs, perhaps twice, okay? But nothing I think is too difficult or anything that should be a challenge for anybody that's here. I just remind you as you walk to watch your step because it's kind of precarious in places. A little bit of background about this tour. When I was doing research on our canal boat here, we portray the 1870s here on the canal because that was the most prosperous decade of the boat operations and the canal company operations. When I was doing that research, I came across a 1960 article in a National Geographic magazine where Jay Johnson interviewed Ernest W. Brown, a Metropolitan Police Department officer who started his career with the DC Police Department in 1896, walking the canal and the Georgetown waterfront. That was his first beat. So there's no relation between Ernest Brown and Bill Brown, okay, just a mere coincidence, but I thought using Ernest would be a good vehicle to talk about the crime and social disorder and all along the canal here in the southern part of Georgetown, the lower part of Georgetown, during the period of the 1870s, okay? Now the one thing you need to keep in mind is Ernest is circa 1896, but he's going to be talking about the decade of the 1870s. That way it allows him to be a little omniscient, knows the beginning, middle, and end of the stories and all. When I am Ernest W. Brown, when I have my hat on, I am going to, if you have any questions or comments or anything, please don't be put off by the fact that I am going to try to answer those in the lingo, if you will, and the phraseology as it would have been back in 1896. Okay? Then if we require a more serious answer to your question later, I'll do that either as we're walking along or at the end of the tour. Okay? A few credits. This would not have been possible had it not been for Jerry McCoy, who's the archivist for the Peabody Room at the Georgetown branch of the Metropolitan DC Library, as well as some of his associates at the Martin Luther King branch of the library. Nick Brule, who's a sergeant with the Metropolitan Police Department, is their sort of de facto historian. He provided me some information about Ernest and his life. And finally, to some of my fellow rangers and all here who were sounding boards for me as I bounced some ideas and concepts off of them, and they've steered me in some directions that I probably didn't need to go. So my hat off to them as well. So, as I said, it's going to take about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes. Are there any questions or anything before we get underway? Okay, we're going to start down here by the statue of William O. Douglas, and you'll meet Officer Ernest W. Brown when we get down there under the tree. Okay, please. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining me on my beat today. I'm Police Officer Ernest W. Brown. This is my first year with the Metropolitan Police Department after spending a year over at the Agriculture Department as a clerk. Came over here and joined the Metropolitan Police Department. Now, I'm very proud that my station lieutenant has suggested that we begin this program of allowing you fine citizens of Georgetown to accompany us on our beat during daylight hours, of course, so that you can find out just how your tax dollars are being spent here in Georgetown, and to hear about some of the things that have gone on here along the canal and in lower Georgetown during the decade of the 1870s. I've compiled some facts here I'm going to share with you. I know that many of you are fine, law-abiding citizens. I also know that several of you have been ordered here by Justice Bucky and by Judge Snell, and you know who you are. By the 1870s, the canal here in Georgetown, the first 22 miles of the canal, had been in operation since the early 1830s. So it had 40 years of history to be not only an opportunity to bring commerce and business here to Georgetown, but also as a venue for crime, and the towpath and the canal boats that plied the canal were a means of escape for those that committed the crime. Now, your police department comes out and responds to many different types of calls. Many to work closely with our undertakers and our medical examiners to determine cause of death, to determine whether someone's demise is of natural causes or of a suspicious nature. We respond to many animal complaints, as you will hear, as they did back in the 1870s and as they are today still in 1896. Many suspicious events and petty crimes, some not so petty, and one which we'll hear about later, which we consider to be the crime of the decade of the 1870s here in Georgetown. Now, as I said, our police department's very proud of the fact that you citizens are interested in helping us out. A good example of citizen cooperation happened down here at Avery and Payne's livery stable when two of their employees grew suspicious when a young man came in and wanted to rent a horse and wagon to go over to Washington City, across down Bridge Street and over Rock Creek to Washington City, and this young man had a mule in tow. And this raised the suspicions of those employees at the livery stable, and they sent a runner up to the 3rd District. Came in, an officer accompanied him back down to the livery stable, and sure enough, that mule had been stolen from one of the canal boats here in the canal. If it had not been for that alert citizen, that man would have certainly made off with that mule down at Marcy and Payne's livery stable. A.B. Mullet. A.B. Mullet lived up here on Gay Street and Montgomery Street, and he had 10 of his prize Brahma chickens stolen at a cost of $25. A couple of hours after this crime was reported, one of our officers was up on the towpath where we're going to be later near the Alexandria Aqueduct and saw a man with a burlap bag over his shoulder, and that bag was all moving and flapping and aroused the suspicions of the officer, who stopped and questioned that man, and sure enough he found 9 of Mr. Mullet's 10 prize Brahma chickens in that bag. We can only surmise what happened to the 10th. David Walling. David Walling was a young man. He was an accountant over in Washington City. He lived up on High Street here, a couple blocks over and a couple blocks up. And he was riding the Georgetown and Washington Railroad, which was the streetcar system, on his way home from work one afternoon. Of course, the streetcars back then were pulled by horses, not like the newfangled electric streetcars that they're beginning to introduce now here in Georgetown. But poor Mr. Walling stepped from that streetcar before it had come to a complete stop. He slipped on the tracks, fell under the car, and the carriage rolled over his lower extremities, causing extreme mortification to his legs. But the fine people of Georgetown had a number of fundraisers and bake sales up at the Masonic Hall, and were able to raise a lot of money to help Mr. Walling and his hospitalization and his hospital costs. Master Bowen. Master Bowen was a young man who was employed by one of the boat captains on the canal. He had taken one of the canal mules over here to what used to be the Duval Foundry, which is now a veterinary hospital, when he was kicked by that mule. And they say that he was kicked so severely by that mule that he was kicked into insensibility. But he recovered eventually. Now, Alex Grummel was not so fortunate. Alex Grummel was kicked by a mule up here by Lock 4. People came to his attention. He was kicked in his midsection. He waved them off and said, "Don't worry, I'll be fine." He got back on the canal boat. The boat went on down through the locks, down the Washington City Canal, which you all may know as B Street, or soon to be called Constitution Avenue, down to the Navy Yard, where he collapsed and died. So obviously, his injuries from that kick of that mule were far more severe than anyone thought at the time. Now, down here in Swamp Poodle, the area between Lock 1 and Lock 2, down in that area, Henrietta Bruce, a young woman who was relatively well known down here in Lower Georgetown, was found floating face down in the level above Lock 1, right down here above Green Street. Her body was taken from the canal. At first, people just figured that perhaps she had over-imbibed and had fallen and drowned in the canal. However, a small star-shaped contusion above her right eye near her temple led people to believe that perhaps Henrietta had come to her demise under somewhat suspicious circumstances. Plus the fact the police department had developed information that Edward Hill, who was an acquaintance of Henrietta's, had, a couple of years prior, served at least a year in the D.C. jail on the complaint of Henrietta Bruce. She had testified against him, and it had been heard in a number of circles here in Washington that Edward Hill had said, "I will get back at Henrietta someday for what she did to me." Obviously, Mr. Hill was a prime suspect in Henrietta Bruce's demise. Information was developed. Mr. Hill was tracked down up to just the side of Seneca, about 20 miles up the canal. He was found hiding in a house. He was taken into custody and brought back down here to the 3rd District Police Station, where we're going to be visiting in a few minutes. While he was being questioned, our medical examiners, Dr. Badesco Williams and Dr. Kleinschmidt, revealed the findings of their post-mortem on Henrietta Bruce, and it was their determination that she had died of drowning and that they could not have a direct connection between the contusion on her head and the fact that she had drowned in the canal. All the charges against Edward Hill were dropped, except for the fact that when he was taken into custody, he was carrying a small revolver for which he was charged with carrying a concealed weapon, and he could either pay a $50 fine or spend 30 days in jail. Right up here on Thomas Jefferson Street, which we're going to cross in just a minute, Saxey Butler met his end in a gunfight between Saxey Butler and William Pope, both of them known denizens of this side of Bridge Street down here in the lower part of Georgetown. It's unknown what their dispute was over, but obviously Mr. Pope got the better of Saxey Butler. He was shot several times in his midsection and died of peritonitis several days later. Mr. Pope fled, and his whereabouts were unknown until they were having the coroner's inquest at the 3rd District Police Station. And a young man about your age came into the police station and said, "You know, there's a man standing on an orange crate looking in the window trying to figure out or hear what's going on inside the police station." So one of our officers went out the back door, took this man into custody, and sure enough, it was none other than Mr. William Pope. And he was taken into custody and stood trial for the murder of Saxey Butler. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to walk up the canal towpath here, about 2 blocks. We're going to ascend the stairs by the Georgetown and Washington Railroad Company and stop just outside the location of the 3rd District Police Station. Please be careful crossing the street. The new, there are a number of velocipedes out, okay, and there are a number of horseless carriages which do not always yield the right of way. So please follow me if you will. Right here in the 3rd District Police Station, it represented different things to different people. Victims of crime, it represented sanctuary, a place that they could come for safety and to report a crime or a misdeed that had been committed against them. To the miscreants that committed those deeds, it represented justice and confinement. And to the police officers that worked here then and continue to work here today, it represents family and a place where men work together for a common purpose, and that is to maintain peace and order here in Georgetown. Right next to the Vigilant Firehouse here, this district station today, just as it did back in 1861 when the Metropolitan Police Department was formed, has a rather small staff for the population of 12,500 here in the village of Georgetown. There are 17 officers and 1 sergeant that operate this police district station. And at nights, often, there are no more than 4 police officers, 1 working each of the 4 quadrants of the village here. So that's important for you all to know if you call for our assistance and find that our response may be rather slow. That is not a pitch for more money or for you to lobby on our behalf. Believe me, we will take care of crime problems and situations here in Georgetown as best we can. Now, to give you an idea of how busy the station is and was, back in the last quarter of 1869, there were 277 arrests, 91 fines imposed, 8 cases sent to the district court over in D.C., $352 in fines levied, and $2,158 in property recovered that had either been lost or stolen. Now, one afternoon, Officer Harper was bringing Henry Taylor here to the station. Henry had been arrested on a charge of disorderly conduct. When they got right here to the front door of the station, for reasons unknown, Henry Taylor took off and bolted down High Street here, across Water Street, and leapt into the waters of the Potomac River with Officer Harper right behind him. However, Officer Harper had sense enough not to dive in the water after him. Henry Taylor's body was never recovered. There was a rather honest lad, Samuel Fuller. He was down at the Union Hotel, down by Montgomery and Bridge Street, when he found a lady's purse lying on the ground. He reported here to the 3rd District Station and turned it in, and it was logged into the police station books, and the young man was sent on his way with a thank you from our police sergeant at the time. Now, there have been numerous reports of rowdy boys up at Frederick Street and 3rd Street, up here in the northwest quadrant of the village of Georgetown here. It seems that on Sunday afternoons, these boys are gathering, cussing, probably consuming alcoholic beverages, and throwing stones at passing horses and carriages. It's believed that some of these rowdy boys may be the offspring or progeny of some rather prominent Georgetown citizens. So if any of you have any idea who these rowdy boys might be, you might let the word go out that a night in our jail cell here will probably break them of those bad habits and behaviors. Now, believe it or not, there was a stampede of steers down High Street out onto Fall Street. It was said that people were leaping out of the way, jumping on the porches and porticos of the houses and businesses along the streets. And it was a problem back then because the drovers that drove these steers out to Drover's Rest on out Fall Street, New Cut and Ridge Road, were supposed to use Road Street and the New Cut Road, which is, you may know as Reservoir Road, out towards Whitehaven Parkway and the Reservoir. But some of these drovers did not heed that advice and still brought their steers down here through Georgetown. There's also been outbreaks of equine epizootic. Now, interestingly enough, the mules that work these canal boats seem to be particularly resistant to the equine epizootic. However, the horses that the draysmen use and all, and delivery men, seem to be succumbing at a rather quick pace to equine epizootic. Now, we hope nobody in this group here today is feeling ill. Okay, that's good. Now, to allay your fears, there's only been one outbreak of the smallpox, and that was at the Uphoff's house up here on Fall Street. Fortunately, they found out that, in fact, the person that had been struck by smallpox was actually a visitor from Philadelphia, which relieved everyone down here in Georgetown, because we certainly wouldn't want to think that any of the sanitary or less than sanitary conditions here along the canal might have contributed to that. Now, people back then have no fear. They blocked off the street and all and directed people to cross Fall Street so that they could avoid inhaling the vapors and all that were coming from the Uphoff's house. We didn't want any, they didn't want anyone to succumb to the smallpox. Now, another big problem related to animals is dogs running at large. Was then, is now. Interesting case back then involving Armistead Havener and his 4-year-old son. It seems young Master Havener was playing with a little puppy in the adjacent yard one day when the puppy nipped the young boy on his hand. Well, fearing that the dog might be carrying hydrophobia or rabies, Mr. Havener put a plate or a saucer of water in front of this puppy. And you know that that puppy immediately went into convulsions, proving he had hydrophobia. Mr. Havener, without hesitation, put his young son in a wagon and drove him all the way out to Aldie, Virginia, where there was the Mad Stone. And the Mad Stone was applied to young Master Havener, and you know it's a miracle he survived his bout of rabies. Now, even our fine doctors here in Georgetown have the Mad Stone. It's just a piece of pumice that you would rub on a snake bite or a spider bite or an infection. The one out in Aldie was said to have had special properties, and obviously that was the case because young Master Habiter survived the bite of that hydrophobic puppy. Now, the police themselves aren't immune to crime. Both Officers Green and Officer Burroughs had their police jackets stolen right here from the lobby of the police station. But fortunately, James Johnson and Michael Crowley were arrested and charged with that theft. Now, there have been some unfortunate cases that happened right in the cells here of the 3rd District Police Station. Elijah Sullivan was a cigar maker. He worked in a tobacconist shop right up here above Bridge Street on High Street. He was brought in on some rather minor charge, probably drunk in public or disorderly conduct, but for reasons unknown, before Officer Banks and Officer Cameron could get to him, he had hanged himself in his cell with a piece of his apparel and was dead by the time the officers got to him and were aware of what had happened. Frederick Hall died in a cell here. The medical examiners concluded that he died of severe congestion to the brain. And poor Mary Beach, she was brought in on a rather minor charge, but she broke one of the rules of the 3rd District Police Station here. She had secreted a cigarette and some matches into her cell. Her clothes caught on fire, and before Officers Wheelock or Wheeler could get in to extinguish the flames, she had been completely immolated in her cell. Now, back then, they regretted to report that Officer Miles, a mere 35-year-old young man, 7-year member of the police department here, died of dropsy in the Park District. Officer Charles Hospital, a rather unusual name, was 43 years of age. He was a 9 member of the department when he succumbed to typhoid fever. In a report to the police, from the police board of commissioners to the District of Columbia 3 commissioners in 1875, they recommended, and I quote, to increase the police force, to implement a system of liquor licenses, fight pauperism, obviously a big problem back then, sneak thievery, and the 4 working conditions at the Metropolitan Police District stations. Now, if you'll accompany me, we're going to walk across this pedestrian bridge over to the neighborhood of Boston. Please, I-S-S-E-L, but over the years it's been corrupted and is now Cecil, C-E-C-I-L. This area between High Street over here, where you see that stop sign, and the down by the Frederick Street Bridge, where we'll be in a minute, south of M Street was known as Boston. We don't know why it was called Boston, but it was made up of 3 distinct neighborhoods: Paradise Flats, Hungry Hill, and Frog Island. 3 rather unusual names, but right here, amidst the mills and foundries, were residences. And here, in the back streets and alleys, like here on Cecil Street and Cherry Lane, down the intersection there, drinking to excess, gambling, and prostitution coexisted with people living here just trying to eke out a living and make it here economically and provide for their families. Down here on the corner of High Street and Grace Street was a disorderly house. Officers Harper, Augustus Brown, no relation to yours truly, and Officer Sebastian raided that disorderly house and arrested Dick Williams, who was the owner of the property, Nellie Holmes, Nellie McPherson, and Annie Gresham. Also arrested were Albert Crane and Edward Preston. They were all spirited away in the Black Maria over to Judge Snell's police court in the district to be dealt with over there. Down here around the corner, just beyond where that man is walking, with his dog properly tethered, is Cherry Lane. Now, one night, Lieutenant Hurley and his men raided an establishment down on Cherry Lane, affectionately known as the Brown Jug, the Stone Jug, okay? It was a speakeasy. It was there amidst the residences and all. And on that night, they took 12 men and 3 women into custody on various charges. Now, you would certainly think that after a night like that, with that many arrests, that there would be some peace and quiet there. Do you know on the very next night, those officers went back and arrested 6 more people at the Stone Jug. And we like to say they went from the Stone Jug to the blue jug, which is what we call the district jail because it's sort of done in a plaster with sort of a blue coloring to it, so we call that the blue jug, from the stone jug to the blue jug. Now, there was a stabbing down here at Prospect Street, Potomac Street and Grace Street. John Harper and Mag Murphy got into a quarrel. Mr. Harper stabbed Mag Murphy several times in the back, and that woman walked all the way up Grace Street here to High Street, right into the front door of the police station to report that the assault had occurred. Dr. Appleby applied restoratives to her injuries and sent her off to the Washington Asylum, where he had proclaimed her wounds to be of a very serious nature. There was a stabbing at a policy house, also down here at Grace and Potomac Street. Alfred Stone and Lloyd Smith, they were both denizens of this area. They got into an altercation. Stone fled to Foggy Bottom on the other side of Rock Creek over here, pursued by Lieutenant Hurley's men. Dr. Kleinschmidt dressed the victim's wounds and pronounced them to be of a most serious nature. Now, if you will, please accompany me down to the location of the old open-air fish market. Thank you for asking. Back in the 1870s, this open area here, between and around, surrounded by mills, was the open-air fish market that served Georgetown. Up there you can see the top of the Georgetown market where produce and meats were sold, fish outside for obvious reasons. Well, right down here, a block down the street, you can see the Potomac River and the thriving port of Georgetown, where thieves and river pirates preyed on sailors and ship's captains like gulls on schools of fish. Some examples. The schooner, the Emily Birdsall, was boarded. The captain robbed of his watch, his account book, and most sadly, his banjo. He believed he was chloroformed. That's how the bandits got the drop on him. There was another attempt by river pirates against the ship, the J.R. Bodwell, where $16 was taken, and there was also an unsuccessful attempt against the boat, the Frederick Fish, which was moored next to the Bodwell. Sailors were advised at the time to keep their pistols at the ready. Now, Mary Tucker. Mary Tucker was a rather unfortunate soul. She was walking across the Potomac Street Bridge here, fell into the canal. Now, unlike Henrietta Bruce's case, which had that cloud of suspicion hanging around it, the team of physicians that examined Mrs. Tucker determined that because of her history of over-imbibing of alcohol, that her fall into the canal here and her subsequent drowning was one of an accidental nature, and they saw no reason to impanel a coroner's jury to look into her case. Officer Harper broke up a fight between two canal boatmen over here. Charles Ingle and Jerry Dick, they had to settle their case before Judge Snell over in the D.C. Police Court. Justice Bucky here in Georgetown, our Justice of the Peace, issued warrants for 3 deserters from the vessel, the A.H. Howe. These 3 young men were found over at the B&O Railroad Station on B Street and brought back and turned over to the custody of their ship's captain for him to met out whatever punishment he felt they deserved. Now, just a little side story here. In the 1870s, people here in Georgetown complained that in order to ride the Georgetown and Washington streetcar, or railroad streetcars, they had to go over to Washington City to buy their tickets. They could not buy a ticket for the streetcar here in Georgetown. Now, in a case of be careful what you wish for, it may come true. As a result, not as a direct result, but later they were able to buy their tickets at the administrative offices of the streetcar company because These two huge, massive buildings that arose here in the late 1870s became the car barn for the streetcar system, and this was the stables, the livery stables for the horses that pulled the streetcars back in that time. Now, just last year, the Capital Traction Company took over the Georgetown and Washington Railroad Company, and they electrified the streetcar system, and these buildings on this side of the canal have been converted to coal-fired generating plants to produce the electricity for the newfangled electric streetcars. Young arrestee by the last name of White broke away from Officer Sebastian one day, just as Officer Sebastian was about to take him into the 3rd District Police Station. He ran up High Street, down Fall Street, down behind the market here, and leapt off of that 15-foot wall onto that terrace below, and then the other 8 to 10 feet down on the towpath below, spraining his ankle. That immobilized him sufficiently that Officer Sebastian, who had the good sense to use the stairs down to the towpath, was able to take that subject into custody. Sergeant Hess, one of our fine officers back then, received the praise from the citizens of Georgetown